on a country with the opportunity, after 14 years, to get its future back.
Keir Starmer just shocked the entire nation by calling it quits after a whirlwind of scandals, broken promises, and plummeting approval ratings. The man who once stood as Labour's hope to challenge 14 years of Conservative rule has crumbled under the weight of his own disastrous decisions. From taking luxury freebies to failing the very voters who put him in power, Starmer's downfall has been swift and dramatic. With the public and his party turning against him, it's hard not to wonder, did he ever really stand a chance?
Game was up.
The question now is, who do you trust?
There was no rain 14 years ago, rather it was sunshine in the rose garden, the birth of a new politics, a new bromance even, albeit a manufactured one.
Working together.
Keir Starmer's Labour government entered power with bold promises of change and competence, eager to present themselves as the much-needed antidote to 14 years of Conservative rule. They had the perfect platform. People were frustrated with the Tories, and Labour had the opportunity to position themselves as heroes ready to fix the country. But instead of rising to the challenge, Starmer's government quickly began to show cracks that alienated not only the public, but even many who had initially supported him.
All forced their way into the national discourse. He won big at his Christmas election. The Tories looked set for years in power.
Mr. Corbyn, this is the worst Labour defeat in decades.
Defeated. One of the first areas where Starmer's leadership faltered was in his failure to follow through on his promises of economic reforms. People expected swift action on major issues like the cost of living crisis, energy prices, and pension security. Instead, what they got was a government that seemed hesitant and indecisive. Starmer promised not to raise taxes, yet within months of taking office, Labour introduced a series of tax hikes that hit the pockets of everyday Brits hard. His government blamed previous Tory mismanagement for budget shortfalls, but after years of campaigning against the Conservatives' harsh policies, it felt like Starmer was falling into the same trap, punishing pensioners and working families instead of offering real solutions. Keir Starmer's leadership, which began with a glimmer of hope for change, has quickly turned into a political disaster. Just 2 months into his leadership, the latest YouGov poll revealed a shocking drop in his approval rating to a mere 22%. This dramatic fall in popularity reflects not just a personal failure, but the growing disillusionment of the public with his leadership. What began as an opportunity to rebuild Labour and restore trust after years of Conservative rule has instead become a cautionary tale of missed chances and broken promises.
We're going to have to renege on some of those promises. Oh, and this pay review body says that 5.5% for all public sector workers. Well, we've got to give them that. Not because we're in the pockets of the unions or anything. We're just going to do it, and we're all going to have to pay. So did they lie to us about the...
Starmer's election victory wasn't exactly a triumph of Labour ideals. In truth, many people voted for him not because they were inspired by his vision, but because they were fed up with the Conservatives. After 14 years of Tory mismanagement, economic hardship and political scandals, Starmer was seen as the lesser of two evils. He wasn't celebrated as a dynamic leader or a visionary politician. He was simply the alternative to a government that had overstayed its welcome. In many ways, his victory was more a rejection of the Conservatives than an endorsement of him or his policies. But for those who hoped Starmer might deliver the change Labour promised, reality hit hard, and fast. Once in power, his leadership began to unravel. The public, who expected bold, decisive action on issues like the cost of living, healthcare, and energy prices, instead saw a leader who seemed out of touch and unable to make meaningful change. His policies, which mirrored many of the same tax hikes and cuts that the Tories had been criticised for, alienated the very people Labour needed to win over. It wasn't long before the cracks began to show, and the optimism that briefly surrounded Starmer's election faded into frustration.
At this conference, Labour ministers will be hammering the message that they inherited an economic mess, and so tough decisions, or spending cuts, in other words, are on the way. And it's that backdrop which makes stories about freebies hard to defend.
Keir Starmer campaigned on the promise that Labour would bring relief to the economic challenges facing the average Brit. But once in office, his government quickly began to backtrack. One of the biggest betrayals for many was his commitment not to raise taxes, a promise that resonated with voters who were already feeling the squeeze. Yet, in a short period, Labour introduced a series of tax hikes that left many reeling, especially pensioners and working families. For those who trusted Starmer's words, the reality felt like a slap in the face.
MPs for things like what Keir Starmer received, or Rachel Reeves received, the Chancellor, or Angela Rayner. In fact, it's kind of a dead cat that's being thrown, and because I think there's a bit of confusion,
Much of the frustration centres around his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves. As the first woman to hold the position, many expected bold, progressive reforms. Instead, Reeves has overseen a range of economic policies that have worsened the financial strain on the public. Her decision to raise taxes in areas like council tax and national insurance was seen as a direct contradiction to Labour's initial pledges. While Starmer and Reeves argued these hikes were necessary to plug holes left by years of Tory mismanagement, the public perception was far less forgiving. It looked like the same old story, politicians promising relief and delivering hardship. One of the most controversial decisions came with Labour's handling of the energy crisis. As energy prices soared, many were looking to the government for support. Instead, Labour's decision to cut the winter fuel allowance, an essential lifeline for pensioners, added fuel to the fire. After years of criticising the Conservatives for their cold approach to vulnerable citizens, it seemed like Labour was doing much the same. For pensioners facing skyrocketing energy bills, this cut felt cruel and out of touch with the reality many were living in.
The election by researchers at Labour Together warns any deviation from the public's priorities could see support quickly fall away. Protests outside the venue today as Starmer is pulled in many directions this weekend, hoping his method.
What makes this situation even more frustrating for the public is the sense that Labour had the chance to be the hero in this story. After 14 years of Conservative rule, the country was ready for a government that would stand up for ordinary people. But instead, Starmer and Reeves have implemented policies that feel eerily similar to the ones they spent years campaigning against. It's left a sour taste in the mouths of many who had hoped Labour would bring real change.
To the news that Starmer's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, earns £170,000, more than the PM himself and more than her Conservative predecessors. And yet Starmer was once interested in their pay.
If Starmer's economic decisions weren't bad enough, the ethical scandals that have surfaced during his leadership have only deepened public distrust. The most glaring issue is his acceptance of lavish freebies and donations, something that has earned him the damning title of King of the Freebies. Since 2019, Starmer has pocketed over £17,000 in gifts, ranging from designer clothes to VIP tickets for Premier League matches. While all of this may be within parliamentary rules, it certainly doesn't look good when the leader of the Labour Party is hobnobbing with elites while the rest of the country struggles.
Or was it just Taylor Swift that was a handout too far? What role did Downing Street play in the VIP escort further to the free tickets for Taylor Swift from Universal Music?
One of the biggest controversies came with a donation from Labour peer Lord Wahid Ali, who gifted Starmer nearly £17,000 worth of clothing, including suits and accessories. That alone raised eyebrows, but when added to the thousands of pounds in other freebies, from multiple pairs of designer glasses to VIP tickets for events like Taylor Swift concerts, it paints a picture of a politician who's more interested in luxury than leadership. Many feel that accepting such extravagant gifts, especially during a time of financial hardship for many Britons, shows a complete disconnect between Starmer and the ordinary people he claims to represent. the optics are terrible. While Starmer and his team push through economic policies that are squeezing the public, raising taxes, cutting benefits, he's accepting VIP treatment and enjoying luxury events. His actions give off the impression that he's out of touch with the struggles of everyday people, and it's becoming harder for the public to see him as someone who's truly in their corner. The freebie scandal has done significant damage to Starmer's already shaky reputation. What could have been a period of solid leadership for Labour, where the focus was on fixing the country's problems, has instead turned into a PR disaster. Critics have been quick to point out the hypocrisy. While Starmer talks about economic responsibility and fairness, he's accepting gifts and donations that seem anything but fair to the average person struggling to make ends meet. Keir Starmer's approach to law and order has sparked a firestorm of controversy, particularly around his handling of free speech. His government's decision to release dangerous criminals while imprisoning individuals for online hate speech has left many questioning whether Britain is inching toward an Orwellian state. Critics argue that Starmer's policies have created a two-tier justice system, where serious offenders are allowed to walk free, while citizens who post inflammatory or controversial comments online are jailed. For a leader who promised to protect civil liberties, this has been a deeply troubling turn of events. One of the most heated debates surrounding Starmer's leadership is how his government has dealt with freedom of expression. Under his administration, thousands of people have been arrested and jailed for what is being classified as online hate speech. Many of these cases involve comments deemed to incite violence or hatred, and while some may argue that these posts were harmful, the government's aggressive crackdown has triggered widespread concerns. Many are asking whether this is really about maintaining order or if it's about silencing dissent. Critics accuse Starmer of blurring the lines between protecting public safety and stifling freedom of speech. Adding fuel to the fire is Starmer's decision to empty prisons of serious offenders to reduce overcrowding, only to fill those cells with individuals convicted of online offences. The release of dangerous criminals, many of whom are repeat offenders, while locking up people for what they said on social media, has ignited public outrage. The comparison to George Orwell's 1,984 inches is hard to ignore, with some accusing Starmer of creating an authoritarian state where dissent is punished more harshly than crime. The Southport incident only made things worse. After protests erupted in Southport against the government's policies, Starmer's administration responded with mass arrests and heavy-handed policing. Peaceful protesters found themselves behind bars, accused of threatening public order. The incident has led many to accuse Starmer of authoritarianism, claiming he is more focused on silencing critics than listening to them. The backlash has been swift, with protesters and politicians alike decrying the government's tactics as extreme and undemocratic. Starmer's clampdown on protests and free speech has left a bitter taste in the mouths of many who once saw Labour as a champion of civil rights. Keir Starmer's leadership hasn't just alienated the public, it's also causing cracks within his party. Labour, once united in its goal to unseat the Conservatives, is now a party in turmoil, with growing dissent from MPs who are increasingly frustrated with Starmer's leadership style. The discontent has reached a point where dozens of MPs are reportedly calling for his resignation. The internal fractures are impossible to ignore, and it seems that Labour's internal struggles are just as significant as the problems the party faces with the electorate. The dissatisfaction within Labour is largely driven by Starmer's failure to follow through on the promises that got him elected. Many of his supporters feel betrayed by his policies, especially those that seem to mirror the very conservative actions they campaigned so hard against. His handling of economic issues, particularly tax hikes and cuts to benefits, has alienated traditional Labour voters who expected the party to fight for working-class interests. Instead, they feel abandoned by a leadership that seems more concerned with maintaining power than enacting meaningful change.
make his speech on Wednesday. Rachel Reeves is going to make her speech today, which she's going to tell us all that it's going to be very tough for everyone, except for them, apparently.
Well, I mean, if you're a free gear Keir, then, you know, things are a bit easier.
That has stuck, hasn't it?
That has stuck, and it serves him right, Frank.
One of the most glaring examples of internal discord came when Labour MPs began openly criticising Starmer for his lack of direction. Rachel Reeves, his Chancellor, was heavily criticised for economic policies that hurt pensioners and working families, and several MPs publicly expressed their frustration with the party's inability to address the needs of its base. These criticisms have only grown louder as Starmer's approval ratings continue to plummet. It's not just a few disgruntled backbenchers. There's a genuine sense that Starmer's leadership is failing, and many within Labour believe a change is necessary if the party is to survive the next general election. Labour's internal rifts have also been fuelled by Starmer's alienation of the party's left-wing faction. Many traditional Labour voters feel that Starmer has abandoned the values that once defined the party. His attempts to distance himself from the more radical elements of Labour may have been an attempt to appeal to centrist voters, but it's backfired spectacularly. Instead of broadening Labour's appeal, it's led to a party that feels divided and directionless, with no clear strategy for winning back disillusioned voters.